Hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries, places where suffering ends, not begins. But in one quiet ward in Japan, patients who thought they were being saved were slowly dying at the hands of the person they trusted most, their nurse. At first, no one suspected anything. The deaths seemed natural: old age, weak hearts, terminal illnesses. But then came the whispers, the patterns, and the strange metallic taste one survivor described just seconds before his body began to convulse. What investigators uncovered would stun the world: a nurse who turned mercy into murder, mixing poison into IV drips and watching her patients slip away, one after another. The motive? It wasn't money or even madness, but something colder, something almost unthinkable. This is the true story of Ayumi Kuboki, the nurse the media called the Angel of Death, and the shocking case that exposed how evil can hide behind the calmest smile. Before we dive into this chilling case, take a second to hit like and subscribe if you love real-life mystery documentaries that reveal the darkest corners of the human mind. It really helps the channel grow. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I always love seeing just how far these stories travel across the world. In the summer of 2016, the Oguchi Hospital in Yokohama should have been like any other local medical center. Clean corridors, quiet rooms, nurses moving briskly from bed to bed. On the surface, it was a place where life and death followed predictable rhythms, the kind doctors and nurses knew by heart. But beneath that routine, something was wrong. Patients who seemed stable at night were found dead by morning. The hospital logbooks filled with notes like unexpected deterioration, respiratory arrest, and no warning signs. At first, no one dared to suggest foul play. After all, hospitals are where people go to die as much as to heal. But as the number of deaths grew, a chill began to spread through the ward. A silent understanding among the staff that something unnatural was moving through their halls. The fourth floor became the center of quiet dread. It was the long-term care unit, a place for elderly patients too frail to return home. The air always smelled faintly of antiseptic and green tea, the scent of sterilization and politeness. But that summer, a different smell began to linger, one that no one could quite identify. Some nurses swore they noticed a chemical tang in the air near certain IV drips, like metal or bleach. Others dismissed it as paranoia, the imagination of exhausted staff during endless night shifts. Still, the deaths kept coming. In a single 3-month span, over 40 patients died, far more than the hospital's usual rate. When one doctor half-joked that the ward seemed cursed, the laughter that followed felt forced, uneasy. Among the nurses, one stood out, quiet, neat, always composed. Her name was Ayumi Kuboki, 29 years old, with a reputation for calm efficiency. She never lost her temper, never raised her voice. To most, she was the kind of nurse you'd trust with your life. But those who worked closely with her sometimes found her unsettling. She avoided eye contact, rarely joined conversations, and moved through the ward like someone following invisible rules only she understood. One colleague later said, "She wasn't cold, just empty, like she was there but not really there." Still, no one connected her to the deaths. Not yet. The first undeniable clue appeared on a humid August night. A patient named Nobuo Yamaki, recovering from pneumonia, was given his regular IV treatment before sleep. By morning, he was dead, his body showing no signs of distress. His heart stopped quietly in the night. His family, heartbroken but unsuspecting, thanked the hospital for its care. It might have ended there if not for another patient who reported something strange. He said that just before his IV was changed, he noticed a bitter metallic taste in his mouth and a sudden dizziness. It faded quickly, but the memory stuck. When Yamaki's autopsy revealed traces of a disinfectant compound in his bloodstream, the quiet whispers among staff turned to suspicion. Soon, the hospital administration called a meeting behind closed doors. Nurses sat rigid, glancing at one another as the director spoke of unusual chemical findings. No names were mentioned, but everyone felt the weight of accusation hanging in the air. That night, the ward was unnervingly silent. No chatter, no laughter, no radio humming softly at the desk. Just the steady beep of monitors and the faint hiss of oxygen tanks. It was in that silence that the fear finally took shape. Someone inside Oguchi Hospital was killing patients, and no one knew who or why. Ayumi Kuboki didn't look like a killer. She was small, soft-spoken, and always impeccably polite, the kind of nurse who bowed slightly when entering a room, her expression unreadable but calm. Patients described her as gentle, quiet, efficient, while her co-workers saw someone who did her job without question or complaint. In a workplace where exhaustion and frustration often spilled over, Kuboki stood apart, emotionless, untouched by the daily chaos around her. Yet that same composure, once seen as professionalism, would later be remembered as something else entirely: detachment. One nurse recalled how, even during emergencies, Kuboki's face never changed. A patient could be dying right in front of her, she said, and she'd look exactly the same as when she was refilling a water jug. No panic, no empathy, just eerie stillness. The first confirmed victim of Ayumi Kuboki's quiet reign of death was 77-year-old Nobuo Yamaki, a retired printer who had come to Oguchi Hospital for what was supposed to be a short recovery from pneumonia. His family remembered him as cheerful, always cracking jokes even from his hospital bed. "He kept saying he'd be home in a week," his daughter later told reporters, tears streaking her face. "He was getting stronger every day." Doctors agreed. His vitals were stable, his breathing improved, and he was scheduled for discharge within days. Then, suddenly, on the night of August 18, 2016, his heart stopped. No distress, no warning signs, just quiet stillness. The nurse on duty was Ayumi Kuboki. She filled out the report calmly, her handwriting neat and precise. Patient expired at 2:34 a.m. despite routine care. The cause of death was listed as cardiac failure. The family never questioned it. After all, old men died in hospitals every day. But something about Yamaki's death didn't fit the rhythm of natural decline. It was too clean, too calm. 2 days later, another patient, 88-year-old Masao Suzuki, died the same way, peacefully, in his sleep, shortly after Kuboki had changed his IV drip. His doctor, Dr. Oda, was puzzled. "It was like flipping a switch," he recalled. "No signs of pain, no struggle, just gone." By the third case, whispers spread through the ward. The nurses tried to reason it away. Bad luck, fragile patients, summer heat, but deep down they felt it. Something unnatural was happening. What none of them knew was that Kuboki had already developed a method. She would inject a small amount of diethyl hypochlorite, a powerful disinfectant solution, into IV bags when no one was looking. It was colorless, odorless in small doses, and undetectable until it entered the bloodstream, where it caused a sudden, fatal drop in oxygen levels. The perfect poison for a place filled with sick people, where death was never questioned too deeply. Later, during interrogation, Kuboki described her first poisoning with disturbing calm. "I was nervous the first time," she admitted. "But after it worked, I realized how easy it was." She claimed she chose Yamaki at random. No grudge, no motive. He was simply the next in line. "He would have died soon anyway," she told police. "It just happened sooner." Those words chilled investigators more than any confession of rage could have. It wasn't hatred that drove her. It was convenience. Killing was, to her, a way to tidy up the messiness of life and death. The fact that Yamaki was a real person, with a daughter who visited daily and a wife waiting at home, didn't seem to register. To Kuboki, he was a name on a chart, a task to complete. When hospital administrators finally reviewed the records months later, they found an unsettling pattern. Nearly every unexpected death shared one common thread. Kuboki had been on duty, often working the same quiet night shifts. And each of those deaths followed the same pattern: rapid decline, no struggle, no witness. It wasn't chaos, it was precision. The night Yamaki died, Kuboki reportedly hummed a tune under her breath while disposing of syringes. A co-worker remembered the sound vividly. "It wasn't a happy song," she said. "It sounded like something you'd hum to yourself when you're trying to stay calm after doing something you shouldn't." That single death opened the floodgates. More bodies followed, each ending the same way, peaceful, silent, and under Kuboki's care. But while the hospital tried to preserve its reputation by treating these deaths as routine, one colleague began keeping her own quiet record of who died, when, and under whose watch. It was a list that would one day expose the hospital's most trusted nurse as one of Japan's most chilling killers, and prove that Yamaki's peaceful passing was anything but. As autumn crept into Yokohama, the deaths on Oguchi Hospital's 4th floor showed no sign of slowing down. The patients were old, yes, but not all were terminal. Many were days from discharge, laughing with their families one afternoon and gone by dawn the next. The medical charts filled with vague notations. Heart failure, sudden decline, natural causes. Each one seemed reasonable on its own, but when lined up together, they painted a pattern too sharp to ignore. And though no one wanted to say it aloud, the truth was taking shape like a shadow forming in fog. Something was inside the hospital. Something deadly, and it wasn't a disease. The first real clue came from a night nurse named Matsui, who noticed something odd about the IV bags in storage. They had a faint chemical smell, sharp and metallic, like hospital cleaner. At first, she thought the disinfectant used on the counter had spilled. But when she opened another sealed bag and caught the same scent, she froze. A few days later, she mentioned it casually to her supervisor, who brushed it off with a tired laugh. "We use those bags every day, Matsui," he said. "If there was anything wrong, someone would have noticed." But someone had, Ayumi Kuboki. She had spent weeks perfecting her method, testing small doses of diethyl hypochlorite on the IVs of patients already near death. It was a common hospital disinfectant used to sterilize tools and surfaces. The brilliance and horror of her plan was that the chemical was already part of the hospital environment. No one questioned its presence. To understand how chillingly simple her method was, detectives later reconstructed the process. During her night shifts, Kuboki would enter the supply room alone, carrying a syringe filled with diluted poison. She'd pierce the plastic seal of an IV bag, inject a few milliliters, and seal it back up. Then she'd quietly place the bag back on the shelf, indistinguishable from the others. Anyone who later grabbed it for patient use would unknowingly deliver a fatal dose. The poison didn't act immediately. It took several hours to manifest, which meant the patient often died when Kuboki wasn't even in the room. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. The cause of death looked perfectly natural. A chemical ghost had done the killing. As the death toll rose, the hospital's reputation began to crack. Families grew uneasy. Whispers spread through Yokohama, and even the staff started fearing their own workplace. "We didn't trust the air anymore," one nurse said. "Every drip, every syringe felt dangerous." Behind closed doors, administrators debated what to do. They suspected tampering but had no proof, and no one wanted to believe a nurse could be responsible. Then, in late September, disaster struck. 2 IV bags on the storage rack visibly corroded, their plastic pouches eaten away by some unknown chemical reaction. That was the smoking gun. The hospital immediately halted all patient infusions and sent the contaminated bags for lab testing. When the results came back, they confirmed the unthinkable. The fluid contained high levels of hypochlorite, the same compound used in bleach. Someone had poisoned the IV supply. Within hours, Oguchi Hospital descended into chaos. Security was tightened, police were notified, and the entire 4th floor was closed off. Nurses were interrogated, inventories checked, and yet no one could explain how or why it had happened. But amid the confusion, one nurse remained unnervingly calm. Ayumi Kuboki. When questioned, she answered politely, with the same flat voice that had once made her seem professional. "I don't know anything about it," she said. Her hands never trembled. Her tone never cracked. Watching her, one investigator later said, "It was like she was describing someone else's crime, not her own." Still, investigators were beginning to circle closer. The poisoned IV bags had narrowed the suspect list to those with direct access to supplies, and Kuboki's name appeared again and again. But before anyone could confront her, another patient died. It was as if she could sense the investigation tightening and wanted to remind them who was really in control. The message was clear, written not in words, but in death. "You can search all you want. You won't stop me until I let you." By October, the tension inside Oguchi Hospital had turned suffocating. Nurses avoided eye contact, conversations died mid-sentence, and every time a patient pressed their call button, someone flinched. Fear had seeped into the walls like mold. After the discovery of the poisoned IV bags, management tried to downplay the situation, insisting it was an isolated contamination incident. But no one believed that anymore. They all knew someone among them was deliberately killing patients. Still, few dared to point fingers. In Japan's rigid workplace culture, accusing a colleague without proof could destroy your career. Yet one nurse, a woman named Yoko Tanaka, had begun connecting the dots. She wasn't a detective, but she had a gut instinct honed from years of caring for the dying, and what she saw didn't feel like natural death. It felt orchestrated. Yoko had worked alongside Ayumi Kuboki for nearly 5 years. She had always found her strange but harmless. Ayumi was quiet, precise, almost eerily patient with tasks others rushed through. But lately she'd noticed subtle changes, small cracks in that calm facade. One night, after another unexpected death, Yoko found Kuboki standing by the supply shelves, staring blankly at an empty IV bag as if lost in thought. When Yoko asked what she was doing, Kuboki turned slowly and said, "It's strange how people die so easily, isn't it?" The comment chilled her. There was no sadness in her tone, no reflection, just curiosity, as if she were discussing a science experiment. Later, Yoko would admit that this was the first moment she truly feared her coworker. Still, fear alone wasn't enough to act. Instead, Yoko began quietly watching. She noted who handled the IV bags, who prepped which patients, who entered the supply room alone. Again and again, it was Kuboki. She was always there before something happened, always calm, always methodical. One evening, Yoko confronted her gently, testing the waters. "You've been on shift for almost every death lately," she said. Kuboki didn't react defensively. She simply blinked, as if processing a minor inconvenience, then replied, "That's just coincidence. We all do the same work." Her voice was steady, her face unreadable. Yoko wanted to believe her, but a quiet dread had already taken root. Something about the way she spoke, detached, rehearsed, felt wrong. That night, Yoko wrote in her private notebook, "If something happens to me, look at Ayumi." 2 weeks later, the unthinkable happened. A fellow nurse, Takahiro Araki, fell ill after accidentally touching a contaminated IV bag. He survived, but barely. The chemical burns on his hand proved beyond doubt that the tampering was real and ongoing. Yoko's fear turned into quiet rage. "Whoever was doing this," she said later, "wasn't just killing patients anymore. They were putting all of us at risk." She took her suspicions to the head nurse, trembling but resolute. Yet even then the response was hesitant. "We need evidence," the administrator warned. "We can't accuse without proof." The bureaucracy of the system protected the killer more than the victims. Then, one night, Yoko saw it with her own eyes. Returning from a patient's room, she spotted Kuboki standing alone at the IV shelf again, syringe in hand, her back half turned. The faint chemical scent in the air left no room for doubt. Yoko froze, her pulse hammering, then quietly retreated down the hall. She didn't confront her that night, she didn't dare. But the next morning she went straight to the director's office. Her report was brief, her voice shaking. "It's her! It's Kuboki!" The hospital finally called the police. Within days, plainclothes detectives began quietly moving through the ward, watching, recording, waiting. And while most of the staff felt relief, Yoko didn't. Because deep down, she knew that Kuboki could sense it too. And when a killer realizes she's being watched, that's when she becomes most dangerous. When police finally approached Ayumi Kuboki, she didn't run, protest, or even seem surprised. She greeted them at the nurse's station with the same polite nod she gave to doctors every morning, as if their arrival were part of her daily routine. The detectives explained they wanted to ask a few questions about the contaminated IV bags. Kuboki simply said, "Of course," and followed them into a small consultation room. The officers expected nerves. maybe denial, but what they found instead was unsettling calm. She sat straight, hands folded in her lap, answering each question with precision, her tone flat and emotionless. "I don't remember tampering with anything," she said softly. "But if something happened during my shift, I must have been there." Her words hung in the air like smoke, neither a confession nor a lie, just a vague acceptance of possibility. It was the kind of statement that made detectives lean closer, instinctively sensing the truth was hiding in plain sight. For hours, they questioned her about the deaths, dates, times, patient routines. Kuboki never hesitated, recalling every detail as if she were reading from a logbook. But when one detective asked, "Why do you think so many patients died on your shift?" something flickered across her face, a brief tightening of the eyes, gone in an instant. She looked down and whispered, "Because it was my shift." That was the first crack. When the lead investigator pressed further, mentioning the name of a patient she'd personally attended, Nobuo Yamaki, Kuboki sighed, her voice almost inaudible. "He died peacefully," she said. "I made sure of that." The room went silent. The detective, stunned by her phrasing, asked her to explain. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering her words carefully, then said, "I didn't want anyone to die when I wasn't ready." Once the dam broke, the confessions came in slow, deliberate waves. Kuboki described how she injected disinfectant into IV drips, estimating she had poisoned at least 20 patients, possibly more. "I didn't choose them for any reason," she said. "I just wanted to control when it happened." Her voice carried no remorse, no anger, only detachment. To the detectives, it was as if she were explaining a household chore. One investigator later recalled, "She talked about killing like she was describing how to fold laundry. There was no hatred, no thrill, just indifference." When asked whether she understood that her actions were murder, she nodded politely. "Yes," she said. "I knew, but I thought it would make things easier for everyone." That line baffled investigators. "Easier for who?" one asked. Kuboki's answer was chilling in its simplicity. "For me," she said. "It was stressful when patients died unexpectedly. Their families would get emotional, and I didn't want to deal with that." In her mind, the killings weren't acts of cruelty. They were acts of avoidance. Death was inevitable, she reasoned, so controlling it spared her discomfort. To her, it wasn't evil, it was efficiency. When pressed about the number of victims, she shrugged slightly. "I didn't count," she said. "Counting would make it real." After 12 hours of questioning, Kuboki signed a confession in neat, precise handwriting. No tears, no hesitation. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they'd captured a murderer or avoid wearing human skin. As she was led away in handcuffs, one officer noticed she bowed politely to the hospital director, murmuring, "Thank you for everything." Later, that same officer would admit those words haunted him for years. "She sounded," he said, "exactly like a nurse finishing her shift." When Ayumi Kuboki's confession hit the news, Japan was stunned, not just because a nurse had killed her patients, but because of why she said she did it. Most people expected the usual motives: money, resentment, revenge, or perhaps some twisted sense of mercy. But what investigators found instead was something far more chilling in its banality. Kuboki didn't kill out of hatred or compassion. She killed because she found death inconvenient. During questioning, she explained that when patients died under her care, it caused trouble. Family members would rush to the hospital, crying and demanding explanations. Doctors would ask for reports. Supervisors would question her procedures. It disrupted the calm, predictable rhythm she needed to feel safe. "I didn't like it when families got emotional," she told psychiatrists later. "It made me uncomfortable. I just wanted to avoid that." To her, murder was a way to tidy up the chaos of dying, a twisted form of emotional housekeeping. Psychologists who evaluated Kuboki struggled to understand her logic. She wasn't psychotic, she didn't hear voices, and she didn't seem to enjoy killing. In fact, she appeared indifferent to it. Her mental state was described as flattened affect, a near-total absence of emotional response. She didn't experience empathy or guilt the way most people did. One psychiatrist compared her mindset to a computer program, efficient, logical, and utterly devoid of feeling. She believed she was minimizing stress, he explained. She thought she was making her work easier, not committing murder. What disturbed experts most was how normal she seemed outside of her crimes. She laughed softly during interviews, spoke politely, and even expressed gratitude toward her colleagues, some of whom she'd endangered. When asked whether she understood the grief she'd caused, she simply said, yes, but they would have cried anyway. The more investigators delved into her background, the clearer her psychological profile became. Kuboki had spent years suppressing emotion, at home, in school, at work. She'd been raised to follow rules and maintain harmony at all costs. In a culture that prized composure, she had perfected it to the point of pathology. Her co-workers later recalled that she often volunteered for night shifts, preferring the quiet over the daytime bustle. She liked silence, one nurse said. She said it helped her think. But that silence became her undoing. Alone in those sterile corridors, surrounded by the dying and the dead, Kuboki's sense of reality had slowly warped. Death stopped being an event. It became a task to manage, like refilling medicine trays or folding linens. During psychiatric evaluation, one doctor asked her what she thought of the word evil. She tilted her head, puzzled. "It's a strong word," she said. "I don't think I'm that. I didn't want anyone to suffer." When he reminded her that her patients did suffer, that they died gasping for breath, she blinked, her tone still calm. "That wasn't my intention," she said. "I just didn't want trouble." Those words would become infamous in Japan's media, the confession of a killer so emotionally muted she couldn't recognize her own cruelty. Reporters dubbed her the Angel of Death, though she didn't fit the archetype of a sadistic nurse. She was something quieter, something far more terrifying, proof that apathy can be as deadly as malice. When the psychiatric report concluded she was mentally fit to stand trial, the lead prosecutor read the findings aloud in court. "She killed to protect her comfort," he said. "That was her motive. Not greed, not hate, just comfort." In that moment, the courtroom fell silent. For many, it was more horrifying than any story of rage or revenge. Because what could be more frightening than the idea that someone could end a life simply because it was easier that way? By the time Ayumi Kuboki's trial began in the Yokohama District Court in 2021, the story had already gripped Japan. The quiet nurse from Oguchi Hospital had become a national symbol of horror, not because she was monstrous in appearance or manner, but because she was disturbingly ordinary. The courtroom was packed from the moment she entered, wearing a pale gray prison uniform, her hair neatly tied back, her expression blank. She bowed politely to the judges before taking her seat, just as she might have greeted a patient years before. The families of her victims filled the front rows, clutching photographs and handkerchiefs. Some sobbed openly, others sat frozen, eyes fixed on the woman who had turned their loved one's final moments into cold experiments. When the charges were read, 3 counts of murder, numerous counts of attempted murder, and tampering with medical supplies, Kuboki's response was simple. She nodded. "Yes, that is correct." Not a single word of denial, not a hint of resistance. The prosecution built its case with precision, tracing the timeline of deaths, presenting chemical evidence from the tampered IV bags, and reading aloud the chilling details from her confession. "She did not kill from rage or impulse," the prosecutor said. "She killed out of inconvenience." He described her as methodical, emotionless, and terrifyingly rational, a nurse who turned caregiving into a system of controlled dying. The defense, meanwhile, leaned heavily on mental health, arguing that Kuboki's flattened affect and emotional detachment made her incapable of understanding the moral weight of her actions. Her attorney described her as a woman who lost her humanity long before she took a life. But when Kuboki herself was asked to speak, she shattered even that defense. "I knew it was wrong," she said calmly. "But I couldn't stop. I just didn't want to face the families anymore." The audience gasped, not because of what she said, but how she said it. There was no tremor in her voice, no guilt or justification. Her tone was the same one she might have used to explain a hospital procedure. One victim's son stood up shouting, "You're a devil!" before collapsing in tears. Kuboki turned slightly toward him and bowed her head. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It was easier that way." Those 5 words, "it was easier that way," would echo through news reports for weeks, a phrase so ordinary yet so monstrous that it seemed to defy comprehension. Throughout the trial, psychiatric experts debated her sanity, but the judges saw no sign of delusion. Kuboki was not insane, she was indifferent. When asked how many she thought she had killed, she said she didn't know. "I stopped counting after a while," she explained. "It made it harder to work." Her detachment unnerved even the seasoned prosecutors. "She's not lying," one of them said later. "She truly doesn't care." Evidence linked her directly to at least 3 confirmed deaths, with suspicions in over 20 more. Her actions, the court ruled, were deliberate and methodical, planned in advance, executed with full awareness, and devoid of empathy. On November 9, 2021, the judge read the verdict. The defendant, Ayumi Kuboki, is sentenced to death by hanging. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Kuboki didn't flinch. She bowed once again, thanked the judge, and was led away in silence. Outside, reporters jostled for statements as families wept and embraced. One man, whose father had died under Kuboki's care, whispered to a journalist, "I thought hearing her sentenced would bring peace. But how do you find peace when the person who killed your loved one doesn't even hate them?" The trial ended, but the unease it left behind did not. The angel of death was gone from public sight, yet her calm voice and empty eyes continued to haunt a nation that prided itself on order, empathy, and control. Ayumi Kuboki had revealed something terrifyingly simple. Sometimes evil isn't loud or violent. Sometimes When news of Ayumi Kuboki's death sentence broke, Japan stood still. The case was splashed across every newspaper, every talk show, every social media feed. Yet what unsettled people most wasn't the scale of her crimes. It was their quietness. She hadn't stalked her victims or plotted elaborate murders. She had simply gone to work, followed her routine, and ended lives in between refilling IVs and checking charts. In a country that valued order, compassion, and discipline, her case felt like a wound that refused to close. Reporters descended on Oguchi Hospital, interviewing tearful families and shaken staff members. Former co-workers described Kuboki's politeness as if politeness itself had become suspicious. "She always bowed, always said good morning," one nurse said, trembling. "We never imagined she was carrying that kind of darkness inside." Across Japan, the media coined new phrases to capture the horror. The nurse without empathy, the quiet killer, the angel who turned to ash. But beneath the sensational headlines was a deeper fear. If someone like her could become a murderer, what did that say about everyone else? For weeks, television panels debated the question of motive. Was it psychological collapse? Burnout? A reflection of Japan's overworked healthcare system? Experts pointed to the brutal conditions nurses faced: understaffed wards, endless overtime, emotional exhaustion from caring for the dying. "Kuboki may have lacked empathy," one sociologist explained, But she was also a product of a system that discourages emotion. Hospitals prized composure, efficiency, silence. Nurses were trained to suppress distress, to keep their faces calm no matter what they witnessed. Over time, that suppression could harden into something dangerous. If you remove emotion from care, another expert said, you remove humanity. The Kuboki case, in that sense, wasn't just about one woman. It was about a culture that demanded emotional perfection and punished vulnerability. But the public's reaction was more emotional than analytical. People began questioning their trust in the very institutions meant to save them. Elderly patients refused to stay overnight in hospitals. Families demanded to watch IV changes firsthand. If even nurses can't be trusted, one woman told reporters, who can? Government officials scrambled to restore faith in the medical system, launching inspections and announcing stricter safety protocols. Yet no policy could erase the unease that now lingered in every hospital corridor. Nurses across Japan reported patients watching them with fear, their eyes tracking every movement. It changed the relationship between caregivers and patients, one nurse admitted. Even when we were innocent, we felt judged, like everyone was waiting for proof we weren't like her. The ripple effects reached far beyond medicine. Psychologists began studying the phenomenon of empathy fatigue, exploring how constant exposure to pain and death can numb compassion over time. Documentaries and podcasts dissected Kuboki's interviews, searching for emotion that wasn't there. In one clip, when asked whether she ever dreamed of her victims, she smiled faintly and said, "No, I sleep well." That single sentence became a national headline, a window into the void that haunted her mind. For many Japanese citizens, the image of her calm face behind the courtroom glass became a mirror for something larger, the quiet despair that often hides beneath civility. Months after the trial, Oguchi Hospital shut down its fourth floor permanently. No patients were ever admitted there again. The ward remained locked, the lights dark, as if even the building itself couldn't bear to relive what had happened. Families continued to visit the memorial outside the gates. Flowers, letters, photographs of loved ones lost to Kuboki's invisible poison. One note left by a grieving daughter read, "You didn't cry when my father died, so I will cry for both of us." And in that line, perhaps, lay the heart of Japan's grief, not just for the victims, but for the humanity that seemed to slip away with each quiet death. When the courtroom lights dimmed and Ayumi Kuboki's sentence was finalized, Japan tried to move on, but her shadow lingered in every discussion about trust, care, and the fragility of empathy. The death penalty in Japan is rare and shrouded in secrecy. Executions happen without public notice, often years after sentencing. Kuboki now sat on death row in a Tokyo detention center, waiting in the same quiet way she had lived, expressionless, compliant, and eerily still. Guards described her as polite, always bowing, never making demands. She spent most of her days reading, sometimes sketching small flowers on notebook paper, never mentioning her crimes. One prison psychologist said she once asked him, in that same calm voice, "Do you think they'll cry when I die?" It wasn't remorse in her tone. It was curiosity, as though she were observing her own ending from afar. And that question revealed what the world had already come to understand about her. She wasn't driven by hate, greed, or ideology. She was driven by emptiness. In the years following her conviction, the Japanese government quietly restructured hospital safety protocols. New systems were introduced to monitor IV integrity, chemical storage, and staff rotations. But while the reforms were technical, the deeper wound was moral. The Kuboki case had shattered something fundamental, the illusion that compassion was inherent to caregiving. "We built our trust on assumption," one healthcare director said. "We assumed nurses could never harm. We assumed empathy was natural. And she proved us wrong." That realization rippled through hospitals nationwide. Medical schools began adding courses on psychological resilience and emotional awareness, teaching young nurses how to recognize burnout and emotional numbness before it metastasized into something worse. Kuboki had become an unspoken warning, proof that unchecked detachment could turn care into cruelty. Yet beyond policy and reform, her legacy lived in the silence she left behind. For the families of her victims, closure never came. Even with a death sentence, there was no sense of balance, no moment that made the loss make sense. "I don't care if she hangs," one grieving son told reporters. "It won't bring my mother back. It won't make her death peaceful." Others expressed something closer to pity than hatred. "I don't think she was evil," an elderly man said softly outside the courthouse. "I think she was hollow, and that's worse." That statement echoed through public debate for months. Was Kuboki's crime a symptom of evil, or the absence of anything at all? As time passed, journalists revisited her story in documentaries and books, each trying to capture what she represented. Some called her a monster born from modern pressure. Others said she was the embodiment of apathy in an overworked world. But no interpretation ever felt complete. Because Ayumi Kuboki didn't fit into the traditional mold of a killer. She didn't gloat, didn't rage, didn't justify. She simply existed, drifting through her own crimes as though they were just another part of her routine. In her indifference, she became a mirror for something humanity fears most, that evil doesn't always come screaming. Sometimes it whispers through quiet hallways, smiling politely, carrying a syringe. Years from now, when her execution date finally comes, there will be no public spectacle. The rope will drop in silence, and the official notice will appear days later in a small column buried in the back of the paper. But even then, the legacy of Ayumi Kuboki will not end. Her name will remain etched in the country's conscience, a reminder that empathy is not guaranteed by profession, uniform, or duty. It's something that must be guarded, nurtured, and never taken for granted. Because when empathy dies, it doesn't announce itself. It just disappears, and when it does, even an angel can become death itself.